We don't just sit and tell you, here's what you need to inherit about the faith, here's what's true. It's an ongoing dialogue about God and life. And those conversations are always best had shoulder to shoulder instead of face to face with kids.
Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast, helping leaders live with integrity.
Well, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about how God is present in the good times and the bad times, and how do we walk alongside our children and help them understand this big concept, but honestly one that is profound and essential as we walk day to day in this life and the good things and the hard things that come our way. We're also going to talk about women in ministry and leadership, and what does the Bible have to say about that, and the tensions that many hold in the greater body of Christ, and just want to have a good conversation around what it means to be female and a leader in the church today. So we have some wonderful guests with us. We have Victoria and Cameron. Victoria, Robb Powers, and Cameron Mason. Vickrey created Reverend Mamas, an online community that highlights inclusive, faith-based resources for parents and children. And so I'm actually going to have them explain a little bit more about what really prompted them to start this ministry. But it started as a joke, according to them, and that they would write books that they couldn't find and they wanted to recommend to other parents. And it actually turned into a reality as they released their own first children's book called My Love, God is Everywhere. So it's so good to have them with us from Texas. Cameron and Victoria, please share a little bit about each of yourselves. And I'm just excited for this conversation.
Yeah, us too. Thank you for having us. I'll go first. I'm Victoria. I live in Dallas, Texas. I'm a native Texan, grew up in West Texas, but have been in the Dallas area the past almost 15 years. I am a minister. I serve as the senior pastor to a church called Royal Lane Baptist Church here in the heart of Dallas. I have been in ministry since a long time. I went to college at Baylor and majored in religion, and then I went straight from undergrad to seminary, and I'm a graduate of Bright Divinity School at TCU in Fort Worth. I worked for a few years as a hospital chaplain, and then I started congregational ministry in 2015. I worked in the United Methodist Church for about 8 years. We can talk about this when we talk about women in ministry. I'm a Baptist, always been a Baptist, but there were few opportunities for me in my own tradition for me to serve as a woman. So for 8 years, I served in the United Methodist Church until there was space for me to come home in my own tradition and pastor a church of my own. So I've been at Royal Lane over a year now. I'm their first female senior pastor, and I'm grateful to lead this community and thankful to be a part of it. So that's me.
Wonderful. What about you, Cameron?
Well, my path is a little different than Victoria's. I also am a minister. I live in San Antonio, Texas, but my husband is a pastor, and so he's serving in the local church here as the senior pastor. And my ministry is more outside the church, but I work a lot with churches. I work for a nonprofit organization called Fellowship Southwest. And we organize churches and Christians around justice issues. We take mission trips and we do advocacy. We teach advocacy. That's a big part of what we do, to empower people to speak up for themselves and for people in need. Let's see, I have 3 daughters. Victoria, you didn't talk about your kids, so you can do that next.
I have 3 too.
I have 3 daughters, and they are 12 and 13 and 8. And that's what consumes most of my free time.
They're at prime ages. Yes, a lot of time. Yeah. So both of you have 3 then. Okay.
Yeah, mine are 8, 6, and 2. So we're a little bit on the younger end of the spectrum, but it's a joyful chaos, as I tell people all the time.
I love it. I love it. We have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old, both girls. And so these topics are near and dear to my heart, but it's great because you guys have kids. Really, you're answering these kinds of questions that you wrote your book for and in real time. So let's start there. Let's just talk a little bit about your children's book, My Love, God is Everywhere. And really, what was the prompting? What was your heartbeat behind it? Just start there. And I'm not going to call on you. You guys just jump in.
We've done a few of these. So I'll start. I'll say this. I get asked pretty frequently as a mom and as a minister by parents for resources to help raise their children in the Christian faith. Resources that are of sound theology, that are biblical, that are inclusive, that help children to inherit a faith that they won't have to heal from later on. I was finding myself more and more often not having a very good answer to that question when parents would say, do you have good books that you would recommend? My kids asking me all kinds of questions about God or Jesus, the church. And I just wonder, what do you read to your children at home? And I was starting to get kind of embarrassed that I didn't have a longer list of resources that I could share with parents. So I reached out to Cameron. We've actually known each other for a long time, but we were always more acquaintances than we were friends. But I had just seen her at a board meeting for the organization that she works for, that I serve on the board for. And I thought, well, surely Cameron will know. She's a minister, her husband's a minister, her dad's a minister, her father-in-law's a minister. It's just like a whole family of ministers. And I knew that she had 3 daughters and they were a little bit older than my kids. So I thought, she might be ahead of the game and will be able to help me here. So I sent her a text one evening and just said, I get this question all the time. I need some help. What books do you read to your girls? And she texted back maybe 1 or 2. And she said, I just find that there's just not a lot of good resources out there. Maybe you and I should write a book. So that's how it began. It was sort of just a side comment, but I have a good friend who is an illustrator that had always promised me if I ever did write a children's book that they would want to illustrate it for me. And so it had always been an interest of mine. So I wrote back to Cameron and I said, look, I don't know if you're serious or not, but I have a friend that would want to partner with us if we did this. I'd love to do it. And she said, yeah, let's do it. So it was during COVID, so we were really hungry for a creative outlet. So I think that was also part of why this worked, is we had this gift of margin of time that we don't usually have, and a hunger to do something creative. So it took a while, and a lot of Zoom calls, and scratch paper and shared Google Docs and all the things, but it came to life, and it's really just an amazing thing, and we're so thankful for how it happened.
I love it. What were some of the gaps you were seeing? Because it's interesting how God often uses the angst in our life. We think anxiety is a bad thing. And I'm like, actually, if we lean in, it often can be the tension where he's saying, I have something, an assignment for you. That's how Courageous Girls came about, was in my own angst and looking for resources as a mom of daughters. So I'm curious, what was the gap you guys were seeing and that you're hoping this book fills?
Well, mainly the gap that we were seeing was good theology for kids. So there's lots of Bibles, story Bibles, children's books that tell Bible stories to children, but there weren't a lot of good foundational, this is who God is, this is where you can find God, books like that we felt like reflected both the theology that we believe in, and also that's simple enough and yet profound enough for a child. And we were hoping that we could write something that children could build their faith from and then not have to heal from later. That's something that, a lot of people like to say now, that, we want to raise our children with a faith that they won't have to heal from, because so many of our peers, so many parents that we talk to now are struggling with their faith. Because it hasn't lived up to maybe their expectations, or life hasn't turned out the way that they had been told that it would, and they don't know how to reconcile that with who they think that God is. And so we wanted the opportunity to teach children from a very young age that God is good, and you can count on God, and God will always be with you no matter what. And so those are sort of the first things that we wanted to teach. And it was fun for us to go through the process of deciding what book to write. Because when you enter into this process of, okay, we want to write a book about God for children, there are so many ways you can take it. And so we decided to think through what are some of the questions that our own children have asked us about God, most of all. And the one that really rose to the top that they've all asked is, where is God? And the reason we love that is because children always wonder where God resides. Where's the location of God geographically? Is it up in the sky? Is heaven in the sky up high, far away? Is God in my heart? They hear that a lot. Is God in church? So literally, where is God? But then what we love about this is that it's a question that grows with you as your faith matures and as you live life. The first time you go through something really difficult or unexpected or a tragedy, the natural question is, where is God in this? Where are you, God? So it's a question that shows up in the Bible all the time. In the Psalms, the psalmists always write, "Oh God, where are you?" So we felt like that was a very faithful question to ask and to teach children to start wrestling with at a young age.
I love it because honestly, in my work where I started, I was called to full-time ministry and ended up being a marriage and family therapist and working with Christians who were asking that question in the midst of suffering. And often their faith was not set up with a foundation of what happens with suffering, a theology of suffering. And I saw the same thing of going, okay, we're teaching beautiful things, but we're missing the gap here. Where is God, especially when hard things happen? So why don't you answer the question? Don't leave us hanging. I know you want us to get your book, but where is God?
Yep.
And especially when hard things happen. Tell us.
Yeah. So the answer to that question is in the title. God is everywhere. And one of the neat things that the book does, the way that we structured it, is it's a conversation between a mother and a daughter. And the daughter is asking her mother a series of questions about God's location. But every question she asks is in a binary, because children sort of tend to think that way. So is God way up high or way down low? And the mother answers the question in a both and sort of way. Well, God is way up high and God is way down low. She asks, is God here in these flowers or there with that dog? Is God here with him or there with her? Is God here when I'm alive or there when I die? The questions sort of get progressively deeper as the book goes on. But we did that intentionally, again, because children learn opposites very early on and they tend to think in either ors. And we wanted to help them, start with a broader theology that encompasses the both ands of life, starting with God being everywhere. So the answer to the question, where is God, is God is everywhere. And there's a spread where the child asks, is God here when I'm happy or there when I'm sad? And that's sort of a way that we kind of tackle suffering without using the word suffering, because that's, the book is for ages 4 to 7. So that's a harder word for kids to understand, but they understand certainly the feeling of sadness. And we talk about how God is there in both. There when we're happy, dancing with us and sharing our celebration because we are God's creation. And also there when we're sad, because God gets sad too. And so for us, it was a great way to sort of talk about the presence of God that is always with us. Something that Cameron often says that I love is, Cameron, you'll have to help me here if I say it wrong because it's been a while, but oftentimes in church settings and with children, we have a tendency to overemphasize the presence of God's power and underemphasize the power of God's presence. So our book tried to sort of flip that and say, look, we're not going to overemphasize that God is all powerful and all in control. It's not to say we don't believe that, but we think what's more sustaining for a growing theology is that the idea that God is always present, the power of God's presence, that no matter what you experience in life, you won't be alone. God will be with you, providing you with the things that you need to make it through. So that was sort of the idea behind it.
It's beautiful. Do you want to add anything to that, Cameron?
Well, I mean, I can tell you more about the book. It's fun too. The questions that Victoria talked about, or she mentioned a few of them. We came up with the list of questions by talking to other parents and other kids. What are your questions? Where do you think God is? Where do you find God? And that was a really fun process and experiment to see what people came up with. And the number one thing that people said was in their dog. And so
brings joy,
Yes,
faithfulness.
yeah, which really resonated with us. And
Um,
probably that's the page that we get the most feedback on, don't you think, Victoria? People will say, we've had people send us stories about how, maybe their dog recently died and this page brought so much comfort to them, and that they really also find God in their dog. And so that was an important page to write. And our illustrator did a really good job of, we didn't even ask her to do this, which we need to tell you all about her and the drawings too, but she drew a dog into most of the pages. The same dog kind of shows up a lot. And so it's fun for parents and children to kind of look through and see, oh, there's the dog, as just a very visual reminder of God's presence. And along the same note, our amazing illustrator, when we were kind of collaborating on this project, which we did before the publication process, I think it's unusual for children's books to be written this way, but we didn't really know what we were doing since this was our first book. And so, like Victoria said, she had this friend who was an illustrator. And so we collaborated with her as we were writing the book, and really worked together on it. And I remember telling her at one point, Joanna, is there any way in the book, in the pages, that you could draw the presence of God into each page? Because that's the whole point of the book, is that, you can. So she was like, yeah, I'm going to work on that. I'm going to do that. And it's there. It's like a little shimmer that you can kind of see illuminating certain characters or certain things in nature. And so if you know to look for that, it's also another like really fun, find the presence of God on each page adventure.
I love this. Now I have two questions. So I'm sorry, I'm a complex thinker, so I have to like regulate my questions sometimes. But one question is really kind of thinking about someone listening going, who maybe is a little more uncomfortable with the theology that God is everywhere because they've grown up with maybe a more traditional worldview, maybe come through a more conservative or even fundamental kind of Christian faith. So where is this different and real biblical versus someone who's like, this sounds maybe a little like a different faith perspective? Okay. And I'm just wanting to answer that question before we continue.
Yeah, I would say that one of the primary scriptures that was foundational to the creation of this book was Romans 8, that there is nothing that can separate us in life or death from the love of God. No height, no depth, nothing present, nothing to come. I mean, nothing. There's literally nothing that can separate us from the presence of God and from the love of God in Christ. And so that was really the foundation for the book, is the belief that there isn't any power greater than the power of God's presence that could separate us from who God is. And so that's where we build our theology.
I love it. Thank you for answering that, because I think there is real confusion in the church around God's presence. And that leads me to the second half, which is around our mistakes. There's that going to Genesis 3 story, right, of God, Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden and being separated from God. And then we have the story of the cross and our redemption, and that God can't be with us in our sin. And so there's all these kinds of things that we tell the narrative of the gospel that create an undercurrent narrative that God doesn't go everywhere with us. And so I love where you're going, but help tease it out a little bit. So how do you bring this understanding that God is with us when we make mistakes, when we're in the lowest places, when we aren't feeling grateful and full of all the fruits of the Spirit? So talk a little bit more about that.
Well, that's a really important concept that we wanted to get across in our book. And so I'll tell you how we did it first in the book, and then I'll talk about the Bible and kind of where we root that theology. But in the book, one of the questions that the little girl asks her mom is God here when I'm good or there when I'm bad? Now, on every other page in the book, with every other question, the mother kind of repeats the question in her answer, yes, God is here when you're good, da, 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 da. Except for on this one, for she doesn't repeat the phrase, and God is there when you're bad, very intentionally, because we don't want children to hear that they're bad, at their core. And so, I can't remember the exact words, but it goes on to say, and God is there when you mess up, when you do
Make a choice that isn't best.
best.
It doesn't mean you're bad. It just means you're human like all the rest.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to really reiterate that concept that making a mistake doesn't equal badness, that we all make mistakes, and that doesn't define you or become who you are at the core. The core of who you are is a child of God, a beloved child of God, and we all make mistakes. But we did want to leave the question phrased by the child in just that way, because like Victoria said earlier, children think in opposites, and they'll hear all the time, oh, you're such a good girl, which leads them to believe that sometimes they're bad, because that just logically makes sense. And so we really wanted to counter that narrative for them. So, I always think about characters in the Bible. They are so flawed. If you look at most of the heroes, so I teach middle school Sunday school at my church, and we were recently studying Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, and looking at all of those characters and how so many of them made mistakes, big, major flaws, or did things or were the kinds of people that the world would deem bad. You look at Rahab. I'm not thinking of any others at the moment, but I mean, you look at David and Bathsheba and all of these examples in the Bible of just fatal flaws, right? But God is able to work through people even then and redeem our actions and use them for good in the world. It goes back to how you, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank, how you interpret the verse that always gets misused in Romans, Victoria, Romans 8,
28.
Yeah, in all things, God works for the good. And I literally, it's like a tongue twister. I can never get it right. But it depends on how you interpret the words, really reflects your theology about things. So God works in everything, God works for good versus God works out everything for good.
Key.
Yeah.
It's really key. I love how intentional you guys have been in thinking about this children's book. I've got a 15 and 17-year-old, and again, was intentional with Courageous Girls, and hopefully am helping many moms really raise up a generation of daughters who know they are loved and know how to love others well, but coming from that place of grace. And that God it's not about being a good girl. So I love that you were intentional about that. We do that a lot I have a history of working as a trained play therapist with trauma and teaching parents often of the words that we use, and they're so vital. And so good girl is a common, it sounds like they're dogs, right. But it's more of a good choice. Oh, bummer. That was a difficult choice, and there might be some cost there. But again, taking out the idea that as human beings, we're loved, we're his beloved, and that God isn't leaving just because we're having a sad day or have made mistakes. Hebrews Hall of Faith is one of my favorite chapters of the entire Bible. So love that you referenced that. Okay, let's keep going. There's so much good. Before we shift to women in ministry, is there anything else that you would really love parents to know about this book, or just even your hearts for helping them really be thoughtful about what they're feeding their children and how they're talking about God and the scriptures with their own kiddos?
Well, one of the great things about this book is it sets an example of how a mother and a daughter, or a parent and a child, can carry on conversations about the faith in their everyday lives. And so the illustrations really show that they're not sitting face to face like we are right now, having chosen to have a theological conversation. They're out doing things together, going about their everyday life. They're on a walk. They're, outside or in the house, and it just comes up. And that's always the way it is with your own kids. It just comes up in the most unexpected moments. And a lot of times I hear from parents that they're not ready. They're not ready to answer those questions about God, especially they feel unprepared. And they don't know how to answer. And so they panic and deflect, maybe say, ask me later, or ask your dad, or, or give some kind of just rote answer, but without having really thought about it. And that's okay. I've definitely done that too. You're not going to damage your child by not answering their question right away. But we wanted to give parents some confidence with this book that there are lots of ways to answer these questions and lots of ways to have these conversations, and that it should be a continual conversation, and not to be afraid of not having the answer. That if you don't have the answer, you can follow it up with more questions. You can engage their curiosity somehow. Victoria likes to talk about how, one of her biggest goals as a parent and as a pastor is to inspire theologically curious minds. And so just acknowledging, like, I'm so glad that you're thinking about God. I'm so glad that you have this question. I don't know the answer either, because I certainly don't know everything about God. No one does. But let's think about it more together. Let's read some books. Let's ask our pastor. So I think being receptive and open to these questions, even though everybody feels unprepared for them, is something that I want parents to be inspired from in this book.
Yeah, I love what you said about the illustrations, Cameron, and the idea of having faith conversations as you're doing other things. I think it's sort of like, I don't know if you follow the Birds and the Bees account on Instagram, but the founder is a good friend of mine and a former church member. And she used to always say, look, conversations about sex and sexuality, we're done with the talk. It's drip by drip. It's an ongoing conversation that we have with our kids from the moment they're born and they're learning about their own bodies till they leave our homes. And you do them in age appropriate ways, but it's a drip by drip, not a one-time talk, the way I think we used to think about it. Did your parents give you the talk? And I think it's the same about faith. Like, this is a drip by drip. We don't just sit and tell you, here's what you need to inherit about the faith. Here's what's true. It's an ongoing dialogue about God and life. And those conversations are always best had shoulder to shoulder instead of face to face with kids, and the way that having conversations about sex can be. So I love that in the book, as Cameron said, we're not sitting across the table talking about God. I don't think that's realistic to do with a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old anyways. It's as we're driving to school. It's while we're getting ready for bed. It's while we're cleaning up our room. It's while we're taking a walk through the park. That's when these things come up. And so I hope the book helps to inspire parents to see that this is a dialogue that's ongoing, that doesn't end, and that's best had while you're just living life. It doesn't have to be, a talk, right? The faith talk, it's a journey that you can have with your child as they grow. So.
I love it. Well, part of that journey is being girls and growing up in faith traditions, and seeing what's modeled before us, how our moms and our dads talk about women, and even who we learn about in the scriptures. So talk about your own journeys with discovering your giftings and God's call in your life. And I know you both have a little bit of a different bent towards how you're using those gifts today, but talk about your own journey there. I think it's an important backdrop before we get into the theology of women in leadership.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very conservative, evangelical, Southern Baptist church. I loved my church. I actually had a really great religious upbringing, but I never saw women in ministry. I never saw them preach or lead or teach or even stand behind a pulpit. So I really had no imagination for what it looked like for a woman to lead. But I knew from a very early age that I had a great passion for the church. I just loved the church. I was there all the time. I always wanted to be there, and I wanted to serve the church. So when I was in high school, I started to think about my passions as my purpose, and there was nothing I had more passion for than the church. So I started to kind of understand that as a part of my call. And so I, like a good Southern Baptist, walked down the center aisle on a Sunday evening and dedicated my life to vocational ministry at 17. And my church was very celebratory because they knew me and I was a part of the family and they loved me. And I think it made sense to them that, what they knew about me, that I would serve the church. And then I had a follow-up conversation with my pastor, and it was sort of about women's ministry, children's ministry, and youth ministry. And I'll say at the time, I didn't feel like that was particularly limiting because I didn't know any different. And so I thought, okay. And it was a logical next step for me as a Texas Baptist to go to Baylor, which is a Baptist school, and I'll major in religion and I'll figure it out from there. I was in a sophomore introduction to ministry course, and this young Hispanic woman came to speak to our class who was serving as a senior pastor in North Carolina. And I'll never forget it because I had no concept of a female senior pastor. I honestly didn't know it existed. I grew up very much in a bubble. So it's not like I just didn't know that we did that in the Baptist tradition. I didn't know any tradition, honestly, had female senior pastors. So it was pretty mind-blowing for me to see her. And in a lot of ways, disorienting, because I remember being just sort of bewildered that she could do this, but also that she wanted to do this. Because if you grow up in spaces where only masculine energy sort of is around the pulpit, then it sort of felt like, I felt like, I remember it, I was 19 thinking, why would you want to sacrifice all your femininity to do something so masculine? That's how I felt. It was like she wanted to coach football or something. I was very and I think the reason why I was so particularly energized by her visit was because she reminded me of myself in a lot of ways. Because she was, I'm Hispanic, she was Hispanic, young, long dark hair. She kind of looked like me. And the way I think about that now is that was a moment of divine confusion because I was really disoriented. And she came one time, I've never seen her since. But I never forgot about her, and I would think about her all the time. And I wonder what it sounds like when she preaches. And I wonder what she looks like behind a pulpit. And eventually that confusion gave way to a curiosity. And so then I had this curiosity about women in ministry. And I found out, crazy enough, that in Waco, Texas, there was a Baptist church with a female senior pastor. And I didn't know that. And so I learned that, and I was at my church. I was at another, a Southern Baptist church on a Sunday morning. And I told my friends, I'd taken my roommates to church that morning. And I said, you know what? I just feel like I need to go visit this other church. I'm so curious about something. Can y'all get a ride back to the apartment after church? Whatever. Drove across town. It was on Transfiguration Sunday, which is this Sunday. So it's always top of mind this time of year in the church calendar. And this female preacher came and she spoke about the concept of thin places in Celtic spirituality, where the veil between heaven and earth is so thin you don't know what side of it you're on. You just know that you're on holy ground. And I remember thinking that's exactly what this moment is for me right now. It's a thin place. I'm on holy ground. You cannot be what you cannot see. And as soon as I saw her, I knew instantly what I was called to do and what I was capable of. So, then the story sort of all unfolds from there. And I learned that there were different kinds of Baptists and more inclusive, progressive Baptists. And then I went to a seminary that was very supportive of women in ministry. And as I said, I was in the Methodist Church for 8 years because in this landscape in Texas, there's not a lot of progressive Baptist churches, but there are a few. And Royal Lane Baptist Church then called me fall of last year. They were in the pastor search process and wanted me to interview. And so here I am. So that's kind of my story of what led me here. But I oftentimes tell people it's important to me that they know that even though you can't be what you can't see, I still knew with confidence that I was called to the ministry within the Southern Baptist walls. So God is bigger than whatever context you find yourself in. And I was going to find my way to the church, somehow. And it started even in a setting that gave me no imagination or vision for it. So, yeah.
Beautiful. What about you, Cameron?
I get chills every time I hear Victoria tell that story. It's just beautiful. It's so cool how our stories kind of intersect and go different directions, but kind of keep intersecting. So I grew up in Dallas, where Victoria now lives, and so did my husband. We, both of us were PKs. Our dads were pastors of the two only progressive Baptist churches in Dallas.
They're like progressive Baptist royalty, like the two of them.
Yeah.
They like married each other.
So my husband's church, his dad was the pastor of Royal Lane Baptist Church for 27 years, where Victoria is now the pastor. So we'll just set that, first of all, it's just really small world, I guess. And I grew up same long tenure. My dad was the pastor of the church in Dallas, where he pastored for 33 years. So that's where I spent all of my growing up years there. And this was in the 90s. We came in 1989 to this church. And first thing my dad did really was lead the church toward being more inclusive for women and to ordain women as ministers. They had, I believe they had, or maybe it was deacons first and then ministers, to ordain women. And it was a really big deal. And it was something that he believed really strongly in. And he was raised very, very conservative, fundamentalist Christian. And so he kind of was on his own path of figuring out a new way to interpret scripture and to figure out what God was up to in the church. But he had kind of just arrived at this and really believed strongly in it and led the church through this process of ordaining women. And helped actually start a different Baptist denomination really around the issue of women in ministry. And so that was the way that I was raised. I was in kindergarten, first, second grade, when all of this was happening. And so my experience with church is kind of that experience of the possibility of women being called to ordained ministry. And so I grew up knowing that not only was it a possibility for me in my life, but it was something really worth fighting for and standing up for. And it comes at a cost. It came at a cost for my dad and his church, but it's definitely something that I grew up believing in strongly. So like Victoria, I was always at church, loved it, had a great youth group experience, and so naturally felt like that is where I wanted to serve too, and kind of spent my life. So I knew that I wanted to go to seminary, but instead of majoring in religion, I majored in art history because I didn't want to double dip, and I'm going to study religion later. So I wanted to just, do something really fun and exciting. So I did art history, which I loved. And then I went to divinity school and I got my master's of divinity, got married. We eventually moved to San Antonio. My husband's a pastor. So like she said, we have, my husband's a pastor, my dad's a pastor, my father-in-law. So we always say that our children are doomed. They'll probably hate the church, but I don't think so. Yeah.
No, because you're modeling health here. You're modeling health.
Yes, I think so. And we've, speaking of modeling health, I grew up in a church that allowed my mom and my siblings and me to really be who we are. They didn't expect us to act a certain way or be present all the time, even though we were, but that was really by choice. And so I'm trying to do the same for my kids. I let them dress however they want to dress to church, and they don't have to go to every single little thing, but they know that they are loved for exactly who they are when they come to church. And that's what I hope for all kids and all families. So.
I know the poor PK stereotype, but it really does come from that very thing you're speaking to. It's the expectations of dropping the humanity, which is going back to your guys' book. Like, God created us as human beings and as male and female with amazing contributions. And so the freedom. I love in both your stories how there was modeling for you, Victoria, from a woman. You didn't really even know her, but just how God uses just that model of, that's even an opportunity. Or and then as you continued to dig in, but you looked like you, felt like you, that was important. And for you, Cameron, your dad, a male. And so there's not a one way or a right way of how God calls us and woos us to his heartbeat. But I hear in both your stories a sense of freedom to be able to step out. Now, you mentioned a cost, Cameron. I'm curious what you mean by that. I have assumptions as I've walked with thousands around church wounds and a lot of healing here.
Yeah.
So what do you mean when you use the word cost to walking in and really stepping into who God made you to be in all its fullness?
Well, I think what I meant in that particular phrase was losing church members. I mean, that's a normal cost of church life. People are not married to the decision of where they go to church, and they are going to come and go and find the place where they feel comfortable worshiping. But when you're leading a church, that matters. It's hard for a lot of pastors to be faithful to where they believe the Spirit of God is leading them in the church, without regard to meeting a budget and making sure that their members are happy so that they, will continue giving and, keeping the doors open. That's also important. So leadership wise, that's one of the costs. But there's a cost just in, I can even remember in college, telling my friends that I was going to be in the ministry and not really knowing how to articulate why that was okay and feeling very judged. So, I quickly had to learn how to answer those questions and be confident about it. But it comes at a cost of, your self-confidence and your, am I really hearing the call of God? Am I interpreting all of this wrongly? And so it does make you really have to second guess and pray and go through, some real intentionality behind that. What are some other costs, Victoria? I know there's a lot of costs.
Well, it's a good question. I feel like I've learned to sort of live among, I don't know if I'd call them costs, but casualties maybe. I mean, I get letters sometimes from community members who just think I have no business, standing behind a pulpit, and letters where they, love to pull out certain texts from 1 Corinthians and women should be silent in churches. So, there is a courage that's required, especially when you're in a more conservative landscape that has more traditional understandings about gender roles, particularly in the church. So that's part of it. But I also now I'm a part of such a vibrant community that actually wanted to call a female pastor. And I'm so thankful because when I came to the search committee at Royal Lane, they had done a church-wide survey asking people for the type of pastor they wanted. And a lot of them actually indicated that they wanted a female pastor, because I think they saw an opportunity for them as a church to be a lighthouse to the community and to expand the landscape for ministry beyond just this church. So that gave me so much energy when I came to the table and started having this conversation with Royal Lane, as I knew this church is primed for a female pastor. So there's some resistance in the community, but internally I have felt so well received and have been delighted by how eager they've been to hear a new voice behind the pulpit, because it is different. If you grow up only hearing from the same type of person with, similar lived experiences, then you really only hear, one understanding of the gospel or one interpretation of what the scripture means. And so I think it's been life-giving to them to hear a new voice from a body that has a different lived experience than every other pastor that's been behind their pulpit. So it's been, there's more gifts than there are costs, for sure.
That's a good encouragement. And it does take courage, not only on behalf of the women who feel called to serve in this way, especially like you said, amongst more conservative or even, fundamental kind of backdrops of where you're moving into, but it also requires courage for the community that comes around that woman. And it sounds like you're in that kind of space. You are mentioning a different voice, and it reminds me, I just spoke last year. I have a lot of admiration for what you're doing on a regular basis, Victoria, but I spoke from our pulpit, and I speak all the time, conferences and do trainings, but from that pulpit felt very different in opening God's word and the expectations on Sunday. And I spoke on the bleeding woman, and I went into extensive, both talking about the trauma of what she experienced, but just the whole menstruation process. And I laughed with some of the feedback I got afterwards of like, oh, that's what you get for having a female do a teaching on that. I think I rarely hear the depth and the level of what she went through, with bleeding and understanding what that would have been like for a woman at the cost of everything. And so curious what you see on a regular basis of teaching from your being female, the way God made you, and how that directs or influences what your congregation's getting and what the community's hearing versus a male pastor. What do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm thinking like this last Advent, I preached on the Magnificat, which is Mary's song that she sings after she gets the news that she's going to have a baby who will be Emmanuel, God with us. And, I sort of, because I'm a woman, I think I read that whole story about Mary in a way that my brothers do not read the story, in the sense that I just think it's pretty amazing that the story of redemption would begin in a female body. Because in my lived experience, the female body is one of the world's most favorite things to shame. And so I find it incredibly powerful and moving that redemption starts there. And when I preached that sermon, I was so overwhelmed by the feedback. And to me, I'm like, I didn't come up with this. This is the story. This is the Bible. But it became really apparent that very few people had ever heard the Christmas story from a female pastor. And they're just like, you're right. It does begin in a female body. Redemption is built and grows and is nurtured in a female body, and how prophetic that is. And, that God would write it that way. And even when Mary says God has looked on the lowliness of his servant, there's something about redemption also begins in lowliness, which is the world's most favorite thing to avoid. Who wants to be low, right? So, and it shows up in that way, just sermons that I'm not intentionally trying to put a feminist bent on this. This is just how I come to the story because of my lived experience. So,
tell her about the tattoo, Victoria.
Oh gosh.
Do.
I love it. Let's talk about your tattoo.
It just exemplifies that this is mind-blowing to people.
This is, yes, I do not have a tattoo. This is about a woman in our congregation who got a tattoo of a sermon quote of mine, which was just so wild. She came up to me last Sunday after the service. She said, I don't know how you're going to feel about this, but I need to show you something. And she had tattooed on her leg something I had said in a sermon about women in ministry in particular. And I had said, if the Son of God can come from the womb of a woman, then surely the word of God can come from her mouth. And she internalized that so profoundly that she had to put it on her body. So it's like on her leg, which was like, it's like flattering and also like, oh my gosh,
be careful what you say.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway,
oh, that's amazing. Yeah. That's a great example. I'm glad you pulled that out, Cameron. Yeah. But I do think as women, even I've been studying in Exodus. I think all our listeners are tired of me talking about Exodus because I can't get out of Exodus. God keeps having me there. But Genesis to Exodus, just the birthing process, like the midwives, there's just this birthing narrative throughout the whole scripture that I think as females and many who are mothers really get at a different level. And it just stands out to us in ways. So you're not making anything up, but you're just noticing based out of your lived experience. So it's a beautiful example. Okay, ladies, we could keep going. In fact, I'm going to have to bring you back to talk more. And I think I'm going to bring a couple friends along on our staff, some of our executive coaches who work with a lot of female leaders out in the church. And it's just a conversation. We even have a cohort of female leaders where we really are wrestling through a lot of these tensions and the spectrum of the body of Christ, of people who, again, would not in their traditions say that a female can be a pastor, and then all the way to the other side, which is a female can be an elder, and everything in between. And it's just a beautiful way for us to hear from one another and to say, God uses it all. He uses it all. It's not a right or a wrong, but it's wonderful to hear your hearts and the way that you've said yes in courage to what God has asked of you. Even in writing this book. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But as we end, I'd love to hear from both of you one last piece of encouragement that you just feel like you want to say, you feel like the Lord's laying on your heart to say to any woman out there, whether she's young or very seasoned, and just what's pressing on your heart that you want to share to her about her giftings, her call, and the way God sees her today.
I think I would just say that there are no limitations on what God can do with your life. So stay open and stay honest.
Mm-hmm.
God is present with you in all of the moments, in the big things that you might do with your life, the way that you answer God's call on your life to serve God and serve the world. But God is also there in the little bitty moments. If you're in the weeds of parenting, if you are a student and, trudging through school, wherever you are, God finds you there, and God is always with you.
Thank you for the gift of your time today, for the ways that you're stewarding the gifts God has given you. It's been a gift to have you. I think I've used the word gift 5 times, so that must mean something. Victoria and Cameron, lovely to meet you all the way here from Oregon. Hopefully I'll have you back here to continue this conversation. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tara.
Yeah. And for those of you listening, actually, to find this book, let's actually tell our audience where they can find your resources first before I tell them about Living Wholehearted.
Okay.
You can.
The book is My Love, God is Everywhere, and it's definitely on Amazon. It's in a lot of bookstores. Barnes & Noble is carrying it. But if you go to Barnes & Noble to find it, it is not in the children's book section. It is in the religion section. So that throws people. Just want to make sure people can find it. I have been known to move it from the religion section to the children's book section. But yes, you can get it most places where you can find books. And we are on Instagram in a joint account called Reverend Mamas, MAMAS. And we post, great book recommendations for kids and adults, things that are on our mind and that we're going through, a lot about women in ministry and parenting and theological resources. And we try to help parents answer the tough questions whenever we can. So come meet us there.
Love it. Well, thank you again. And if you are wanting any resources and want to learn more about our professional counseling, our executive coaching, our cohorts, you can go to go to livingwholehearted.com and join our newsletter there, or subscribe. Share this with someone else. But if you are a mom of a daughter and want to grow in your own understanding of who you are and help your daughter to see the goodness of who she is and have these ongoing conversations, pick up this book and go to mycourageousgirls.com, where you're going to find ongoing resources from 2nd grade all the way through high school that are going to help you have these very intentional conversations and to develop a community with other women and daughters who are on the same journey as you. So, such a gift to be with you today. And until next time, continue to grow and becoming the leader you would follow.
Well, did you know that we're not just podcasters? One of the best ways to connect with Tara and I and our whole team at Living Wholehearted is our website, livingwholehearted.com. There you're going to find the books that we've written, our e-courses, executive coaching, organizational development, and professional counseling services. And then one of our favorite things that we're up to these days, our Wholehearted Leadership Cohorts, where we take groups of leaders for 1 to 2 year journeys together. It's amazing. While you're there, for fresh content, make sure that you sign up for our e-newsletter. That's where we're putting out stuff every month that you want to keep close with. So visit livingwholehearted.com.
You can also join us on socials at living_wholehearted on Instagram, and we are Living Wholehearted on Facebook. You can also follow me at Tara Matson on Instagram. We love to engage with you personally there, so make sure you reach out. Leave us a review if you're enjoying this podcast.
Hey, thank you for caring about being the kind of person and leader that lives with integrity.